Hi there. Today we're going to be starting a new project where we're finishing this Explorer in the color Frost Blue. It's a finish that Gibson started offering back in the early 60s. Both our body and neck are Korina wood, which is an open grain species. So first we're going to start off with our grain filler. Then we're going to seal up everything with a sanding sealer. We've got our color coats, and then finally our clear coats. Once all that's applied, we wet sand everything level, and then we do a two-step polish at the very end. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Hi there. For today's project, we're going to be working on a set neck guitar. It's an Explorer body shape, and we're going to be painting it Frost Blue, which is one of the early Gibson custom colors from the early 60s. It's an opaque color, which I just think looks really good on this body shape with gold hardware. This wood is Korina white limba, which is an open grain wood, so we'll be pour filling it today. A lot of times people prefer to do just a wash coat of sealer or clear lacquer, just as kind of a first step to just kind of aid the process of grain filling. But this guitar was already stripped of a finish, so a lot of the pours probably still have remnants of some sealer or lacquer already in there, so I think we can just go right to grain filling. So we'll be taping off the fretboard, and then we'll move on to grain filling, and then we'll let it dry overnight before we move on to our sealer coats. Okay, so we're just using green painter's tape. I like frog tape, just I've never really had any issues with lacquer creeping up under it. It's always worked well for me. So we're basically just taping off all the rosewood because we don't want any grain filler to get onto that. If it does, it's not a huge deal, you know, we just sand it off, but this is super easy and it's just standard prep. So we're just getting right on that edge between the fretboard and the Korina. We're gonna cover the nut as well. Okay, so we're working with our natural colored oil-based grain filler today. I like to put out a sheet of paper or cardboard just to, you know, make your cleanup a little bit easier. I have a respirator because there is some fumes. It's mineral spirit based, and it just, you know, it does give off some fumes. I like to wear gloves and also safety glasses just in the event that something splashes up, you don't want it in your eyes. I mixed this a few minutes ago, but it does settle out really quickly. You know, if it's been on the shelf for more than a couple of days, it really separates. So it could take you, you know, 3, 4, 5 minutes to stir it and get it to a proper consistency for application. Once it's all mixed, it should look like, you know, kind of like runny peanut butter. It's kind of like a mud. And basically the process is we're going to apply it on the entire back surface, and then we're going to wait about 10 minutes, and you're going to see the kind of gloss look of it kind of go away and turn matte as the solvents evaporate from it. And then at that point we'll use a scraper and scrape perpendicular with perpendicular to the grain to remove all the excess, and then we'll flip it over and do the same on the other side. When choosing a color for your grain filler, you'll want to consider the wood that you're working with and the intended final finish. If it's an opaque finish, you can really apply any color as it's going to be covered up, but sometimes I'll still choose something like a red mahogany so that if we're working on a relic or you have a chip in the finish, it can be neat to have kind of a contrasting color underneath. If you're working on a transparent or semi-transparent finish, you'll usually want your filler to either be darker or potentially the same color as the wood. Natural grain filler dries to a very light shade, which works well on ash or Korina, but it can look out of place on something like mahogany. When applying a darker grain filler, many people prefer to put down 1 to 2 coats of sealer first so that you're only filling the grain pattern. However, if you want to simultaneously stain the surface, apply the filler to the bare wood and then follow up with your sealer coats once it dries. Okay, so this has had about 15 minutes to dry, and you can see that a lot of the shine has gone off and now it just has this kind of matte look to it. That means that a lot of the mineral spirits have evaporated off and we're good to start scraping it. I like just using these little plastic scraping tools. You know, you get them at the hardware store for a few bucks. They work really well. I know some people will use like a small like Stanley razor to go at it, and those work also. This is just, you know, less consequence, and I feel like you can cover a big area pretty quickly. We're gonna go perpendicular to the grain so that we're not pulling the grain filler back out as we're doing it. And then once the surface has been entirely scraped, we're gonna use a coarse cloth. This is just like a coarse like painter's cloth, just to kind of buff off any residual grain filler that's still sitting on the surface. Now with all this excess grain filler, you can easily reuse this. You know, you can put it back into your can and just splash it with a little bit of mineral spirits, stir it up, and it's completely reusable. It's a good idea to plug your bushing holes, just because since there's no back to them, they can be tough to kind of clean out. Earplugs work really well. That's what I like to use for the most part, but I don't have any today, so I've just, you know, crumpled up some paper towels and put them in and fish them out with a flathead or needle nose pliers later. But it's a lot easier than trying to scrape out wet or dry grain filler. We've completed and scraped and buffed every surface off now. So we'll let this dry overnight, and then we'll be on to our sanding sealer coats, color coats, clear coats, and, you know, wet sanding and polishing the whole bit. And yeah, this looks good. Okay, so we let this dry overnight. We grain filled it yesterday. It looks like one coat was enough. We're gonna be taking off the tape off the fretboard in a few minutes and just block sanding the entire thing. So we want the grain filler to stay in the pores, but anything that's still on the surface that didn't get kind of buffed off with our cloth, we want to remove that and just make sure everything's really nice and flat for our sanding sealer. Once we've sanded, we will retape just the face of the fretboard so that the sealer does make contact with the sides of the fretboard. And, you know, just in the series of tapings kind of throughout it as we get to the color coats and clear coats and everything. So yeah, we'll get started with the sanding. I'm just using 400 grit. I like these little sanders, block sanders. You can just kind of cut the paper to size and set it up. We're gonna be dry sanding, so you might have to swap papers once or twice. I'm gonna wear a respirator and glasses just because, you know, dust can get kicked up from it. And yeah, so we'll get to it. Okay, so we block sanded all the grain filler, everything's nice and smooth. Before we move on to our sealer coats, we're gonna tape off just the face of the fretboard. We want the sealer to go into the sides, so we're gonna leave those exposed. And then when we get onto the color coats later, we'll actually retape the sides again so that those don't get the colored finish on it. And then we'll remove those again and just do the top so that the clear can go on. So, you know, it's a series of taping. That's how it is. They're just using green painter's tape here, and yeah. So some people lay down the tape and then kind of cut it off the side. I just use the straight edge of the tape to kind of be the edge anyway, and just make sure it's nice and lined up with the corner. I just use my fingernail to make sure it's wrapped well around the frets so that you don't get any lacquer creeping under there. It still can happen, but just do as good a job as possible to get it tacked on right. Quart of sanding sealer here. Realistically, on this, we can probably get by with one of the 8-ounce cans. But we're gonna crack this open just in case we need more. Since it's a high solids content, we really want to mix it up well. You can see, like, it's been sitting probably for a couple weeks, so there is some settling that's occurred on the bottom. Just all the solids. Basically, for the most part, sanding sealer is like clear lacquer, but with, you know, 3 times the amount of solids in it. Plus there's a little bit of zinc to kind of aid in the sanding, just to make it sand out easier. So it is quite a bit thicker. Before we start spraying, it's a good idea to always give your instrument a quick once over with a tack cloth. This helps to remove any sanding, dust, or debris from the surface. We're only showing you a portion of the spraying, but we're going to apply 3 coats of sanding sealer, each spaced 1 hour apart from each other, and each coat consisting of 3 passes. It's always important to make sure that the humidity is 50% or lower when you're spraying lacquer. Anything above that, you can run into blushing issues, which is when moisture becomes trapped in the finish and gives off kind of a cloudy or milky-like haze. This can be corrected by spraying some blush remover, also known as lacquer retarder, over top. But if you stick to only spraying on days that are lower than 50% humidity, you shouldn't really have to worry about this. Okay, so our sanding sealer coats have had a night or so to dry. Everything's ready for wet sanding. So we're gonna wet sand the entire surface flat with 400 grit. If you're new to wet sanding, you might wanna do 600 grit, just less chance of kind of sanding through to the bare wood. If that does happen, just, finish up, and then before you spray your color coats, just hit that area with a quick spray of sealer just to make sure you're not spraying onto bare wood. I'm using mineral spirits for wet sanding. I like to use mineral spirits or naphtha just because it's less chance of swelling the wood. If you use like soapy water, it can get in any kind of cavities or bare wood areas and kind of swell the wood and ruin your finish. Just get yourself a little stack of paper towels just so you can check your work often and make sure that you're sanding out all the divots, but that we're not going into bare wood. The whole purpose of today is basically to get out any kind of an orange peel or any kind of texture where it's kind of going into the pores. We just want to bring everything completely flat so it's a nice surface for our color coats. So yeah, we'll get to it. Okay, so we finished our wet sanding. We sanded everything nice and level. We don't have any kind of shiny divots in the surface. Everything's nice and matte in appearance. So we'll let this dry overnight just because the mineral spirits, if there's any kind of left in the surface or in any kind of nooks and crannies, it can kind of react with the lacquer and give a fisheye effect, kind of like oil and water. So I like to just let it dry overnight, make sure everything's evaporated, and then we'll move on to our color coats tomorrow. Okay, so yesterday we wet sanded all of our sealer coats nice and level. We let it sit overnight just in case there was mineral spirits still kind of soaked into the wood or in any cavities. We don't want it to contaminate the lacquer when we're doing our color coats today. Before we spray our frost blue color coats, we're just going to tape off the side of the fretboard because we want to leave that colorless. We want to do everything except that rosewood fretboard. So we'll just tape that off and then we'll be good to go. All of our lacquers can be sprayed as is right out of the can, but depending on your setup, you may want to thin it to something like a 1:3 or 1:4 ratio of thinner to lacquer. Thinner can also help to make sure that you've properly mixed all of the pigments that can settle on the bottom of the can. After I open a can, I usually stir it for a couple of minutes and then empty it into a mixing cup. And then I put another splash of thinner into that can, mix it around, and just combine that with everything. And that just helps to make sure everything is completely mixed. Okay, here we're on to our frost blue color coats. This color opaques very quickly, so we only needed to spray one full coat, which was made up of 3 passes. Anytime you think your color coats are finished or close to finished, it's just a good idea to take it outside once it's dry to the touch and check it in the sunlight just to make sure that there's no blotchy or streaking areas and that everything is completely consistent. Once you've determined that the color coats are finished, let it dry overnight before moving on. Okay, so yesterday we did our 3 coats of frost blue. Everything came out nice and smoothly. We just removed the tape on the side of the fretboard. Usually it's kind of a good idea to do it while the lacquer's still a little bit soft, you know, within an hour or 2 of spraying it. where it's dry to the touch, but it still has a little bit of give. Kind of forgot to do it, so we did it today, and everything turned out good, but you know, you do run the risk of just having it be a little bit more brittle and, you know, a possible chip occurring, but everything was clean, so worked out. I'm gonna tape off everything to just leave the front of the headstock exposed so we can paint it black. I use a little bit of pinstriping tape just to get up nice to the edge, and then I kind of just fill in the rest of the area with just regular painter's tape because it's a little bit wider. And I mean, you can use paper or whatever you want to kind of block off the rest of the instrument. I often just use a big garbage bag just because it's really easy and you can kind of just tape it up at the headstock. So yeah, we'll get to that now. If you look at examples of finishes on set neck guitars, you'll see they often have a black headstock face. Fender will also finish some of their headstocks to match the body. When I tape off a headstock face, I like to leave about 1 to 2 millimeters on the side just to give a little bit of depth, similar to an overlay. Spraying a headstock is a relatively quick step. Just like spraying other areas, we want to make sure that we give it a consistent spray on all the sides and corners, and if we need to apply multiple coats, we always want to leave approximately an hour between them. Once the final coat is sprayed, give it about an hour to dry, and then carefully remove the tape and anything else that you use to mask off the rest of the guitar. Alright, we're on to our clear coats. We're not showing the full process, but we applied 12 coats total, 3 per day for 4 days, spaced 1 hour apart. You can get by with less than this if you want, but once you start wet sanding everything level, it's much easier to end up with sand throughs. This is fine if you want your instrument to have a certain level of relicking, but if you're after a factory looking finish, I generally like to do a minimum of 10 coats. When spraying clear, we're always checking to make sure that the surface remains clean and free of dust and debris. I always use a tack cloth to gently wipe everything down before each coat. If something does happen to land in the finish, it's usually best to just stop spraying, let it dry overnight, and then tackle it with a light grade of sandpaper the next day, something like 600 grit. If you try to remove it when the finish is soft, there's a fair chance you'll end up pushing it deeper into the finish. Before we do our final wet sanding, I like to let everything dry for 4 weeks after the final clear coat has been applied. This is enough time for most of the solvents to flash off, and when the finish is nice and hard, it's much easier to level and buff. I like to start off with 400 grit and progress to 1200 or 1500 grit before moving on to polishing. Just like earlier in the video, we're using mineral spirits for our wet sanding solution as it won't swell the wood. We're spending most of the time on our first grit. So we're using 400 grit, but if you're new to finishing, you can start with 600 as there's less chance of sanding through. It'll just take a little bit longer to get that initial leveling finished. Keep wiping dry the area that you're working on, as we only want to sand out any of the spots that still have shiny divots. Once the sandpaper makes contact with those areas, it'll appear matte instead of glossy, and that's when we need to stop sanding and go up a grit. Each subsequent grit will be removing the scratches caused by the previous. It's a good idea to use a sanding block so that you don't end up with inconsistencies in your surface. And for the cutaways and contours, I usually just have a small 4-inch strip ready to go of each grit. After we've completed our wet sanding, we're on to our final polishing, which consists of a medium and a fine compound. Apply each of these to a clean microfiber cloth and work it into the surface in small circular patterns. The medium polish will do most of the work in removing scratches from the sanding and will bring out a lot of the gloss. Once you've completed the medium compound, repeat the process with a fine compound, and this will remove the last few micro scratches or swirl marks. If you finish this step and can still see a fair amount of scratches, you may need to repeat the medium polish or potentially even go back to 1500 grit wet sanding, but give the medium polish another shot first as it's quite effective.